Imagine living in a world where the government solves its money problems the simplest way possible. It just makes more money. At first, that sounds like genius. If the treasury is empty, print more notes. If soldiers need to be paid, print more notes. If a war is expensive, print more notes. Why raise taxes? Why borrow? Why cut spending? When you can just create currency out of thin air. Until one day, everybody realizes that the paper in their hands is multiplying faster than the goods they want to buy. And suddenly, prices start rising, then rising faster, then rising so fast that money stops feeling like money at all. In this episode, we're going to look at the empire that invented the money printer and helped invent one of history's oldest financial disasters, hyperinflation. This is the story of medieval and early modern China, especially under the Song and Yuan dynasties, where paper money moved from brilliant innovation to dangerous overuse. Because long before central banks, long before modern inflation debates, and long before people joked online about money printer go brr, one empire had already learned the hard way what happens when a state creates too much money. Let's start with the obvious question. Why did China invent paper money in the first place? The answer is simple: convenience. In the ancient and medieval world, most money was heavy. If you were dealing in copper coins, you needed a lot of them. Serious trade meant serious weight. Merchants moving goods across long distances didn't just need guards to protect their cargo. They also needed a practical way to carry value. China, especially during the Song dynasty, had a large and sophisticated commercial economy. Cities were growing. Trade was expanding. Markets were becoming more integrated. And the older system of metal coinage was starting to struggle under the sheer scale of economic activity. Imagine trying to run a booming economy where every major transaction requires strings of metal coins. It was inefficient, clumsy, and risky. So merchants started using paper instruments. At first, these were not government notes in the modern sense. They were more like private certificates, promissory notes, or deposit receipts. Instead of carrying huge amounts of coin, a merchant could deposit money and use paper claims instead. The state noticed, and eventually the government stepped in and formalized the process. This was the great breakthrough. Paper money was lighter, easier to transport, easier to count, and easier to issue than metal coins. It allowed the state to support long-distance trade and make taxation, military payments, and administration more efficient. In other words, paper money was not a sign of decline at first. It was a sign of sophistication. This is important because we often tell inflation stories as if the invention itself was the problem. It wasn't. Paper money was a brilliant solution to a real economic challenge. The problem came later, when the state realized just how tempting it was to control the printing. Once a government can issue paper money, it gains a new kind of power. A metal coin has to be mined, smelted, and minted. That creates a natural limit. Paper is different. If people trust it, you can produce far more of it far more quickly. And that trust becomes everything. Money works because people believe it will hold value long enough to use it. The second people begin to doubt that, the entire system starts to wobble. During the Song dynasty, paper money was often regionally limited and, at least in some phases, tied to attempts at regulation. Authorities understood that too much paper chasing too few goods could become a problem. So, in theory, they placed limits on issuance and expiration periods on notes. But theory and practice are rarely the same. The Song state faced constant pressure, military threats from rival states to the north and west, large administrative costs, and the challenge of governing a huge empire. Wars are expensive. Bureaucracies are expensive. Defending borders is expensive. And printing paper is easy. That is the core trap. A financial innovation created for efficiency slowly becomes a fiscal temptation. The state begins using money creation not just as a convenience, but as a solution to shortages. At first, this may not seem catastrophic. If the economy is growing, if trade is strong, if people still trust the notes, the system can absorb a lot. But once issuance gets ahead of confidence, problems appear. Prices begin to rise because more money is circulating relative to available goods. People start preferring harder forms of value, silver, grain, cloth, anything more tangible than paper. Merchants demand more notes for the same goods because they no longer trust tomorrow's value. And when that behavior spreads, inflation becomes self-reinforcing. The state, meanwhile, is often tempted to respond in exactly the wrong way. If prices are rising and costs are higher, the government needs more money to pay soldiers and officials. So it issues more notes, which causes more inflation, which raises costs further, which encourages even more issuance. This is how a financial innovation turns into a spiral. Now we move to the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol-led empire that conquered China in the 13th century. The Mongols inherited Chinese administrative traditions, but they also pushed paper currency even further. Under Kublai Khan and his successors, paper money became a central feature of imperial finance. This is one reason visitors from outside China were so astonished. To many foreigners, including famous travelers like Marco Polo, the idea that the emperor could take bark, stamp it, declare it money, and make the entire realm accept it seemed almost magical. And in one sense, it was magical. A state was transforming paper into purchasing power by command. That is a remarkable act of political authority. But political authority is not the same thing as economic stability. The UN government leaned heavily on paper money, and like many states facing huge military and administrative burdens, it struggled to resist over-issuing it. Campaigns, court expenses, rebellions, and the costs of ruling a vast empire all created pressure for more revenue. Again, printing looked easier than reform, and again, over time, confidence weakened. If people suspect that more and more paper will keep being issued, they start spending it faster, discounting its future value or avoiding it altogether. The official money remains legal, but in practice, people search for alternatives. This is one of the most revealing things about inflation. You can order people to accept money by law. You cannot force them to trust it forever. The more governments abuse the privilege of issuing currency, the more ordinary people retreat into whatever they think will hold value: silver, goods, foreign coin, land, food, or barter. And once that happens, the paper money system may still exist on paper, but it starts losing its real economic authority. That is what happened repeatedly in imperial China. Not all phases were the same. There were periods of greater discipline and periods of chaos. Some paper money systems functioned fairly well for a time. Others collapsed more dramatically. But the overall lesson was clear enough that later dynasties remembered it. The Ming dynasty, for example, also experimented with paper notes, but confidence issues and inflation problems helped sour rulers and markets on paper money for long periods afterward. In many cases, silver reasserted itself as the trusted medium of exchange. That tells you something profound. People will use highly abstract money if they trust the issuing authority. But if that trust is broken, they often run back towards something that feels harder, scarcer, and less manipulable. And this is why the story feels so modern. Because even though we live in a world of central banks, digital payments, fiat currencies, and sophisticated monetary policy, the underlying psychology hasn't changed much at all. When people believe money is being created responsibly, the system works. When they believe it is being created recklessly, they panic, speculate, hoard, and lose faith in prices, wages, savings, and contracts. That is why inflation is not just an economic event. It is a social event. It changes how people behave. It changes what they trust. It changes how they think about the future. A stable currency encourages planning. An unstable one encourages escape. And imperial China gave the world one of the earliest examples of this problem on a massive scale. Now, it's worth being careful with the word hyperinflation. Modern hyperinflation usually refers to very extreme and rapid collapses in currency value, like Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, or more recent cases. Some episodes in Chinese history are better described as severe inflation or repeated currency debasement, rather than hyperinflation in the modern technical sense. But for a podcast title, the bigger truth still holds. This was an empire that discovered both the power and danger of the money printer long before the modern age. What makes the story fascinating is not just that China invented paper money. It's that the invention was genuinely ahead of its time. This was not a backward state making an obvious mistake. It was one of the most advanced economies on Earth, pioneering a monetary technology the rest of the world would adopt much later. That's what makes the cautionary tale stronger. The more sophisticated the tool, the more damage it can do when misused. Paper money let governments mobilize resources more efficiently than metal coin ever could. It helped support trade. It reduced transaction costs. It reflected a level of state and market development that many other regions had not yet reached. But it also removed a restraint. And once that restraint was gone, rulers facing short-term pressure often chose the easy answer over the sustainable one. Print now. Deal with the consequences later. History is full of governments doing exactly that. The details change. The technology changes. The language changes. But the temptation remains the same. A state under pressure wants flexibility. Money creation offers flexibility. And unless that flexibility is limited by institutions, discipline, and credibility, it can become a trap. That is the deeper lesson of this story. The money printer is not just a machine. It is a political temptation. It promises painless solutions to painful problems. It tells rulers they can spend without immediately taxing, fight without immediately borrowing, and delay hard choices without immediate collapse. And sometimes, for a little while, that even seems true. Until prices catch up. Until trust erodes. Until people realize the empire is producing claims on wealth faster than actual wealth itself. That is when the magic turns into a warning. So, did this empire invent the money printer? In a meaningful sense, yes. Imperial China was the first great civilization to issue paper money on a large scale and show the world that states could create a functioning currency out of paper, ink, and authority. And did it help cause inflation by overusing that power? Also, yes. The same innovation that made trade easier also made fiscal indiscipline easier. The same tool that expanded economic possibility also expanded the state's ability to outrun monetary credibility. That contradiction is why this story matters. Because it is not really about ancient paper notes. It is about the eternal tension between innovation and restraint. Every monetary system depends on trust. Every government wants room to maneuver. And every era eventually discovers the same hard truth. You can create money faster than you can create value. And when you forget the difference, inflation is waiting. So the next time you hear a joke about governments solving everything by printing cash, remember that this debate is older than modern banking, older than capitalism in its present form, older even than Europe's rise to global dominance. One of the first empires to try it was doing it centuries ago, and it learned the same lesson everyone eventually learns. The money printer is powerful, but it is never free.